Kia ora, magma. We're going to be talking a lot about magma. I love magma. Volcanoes are fueled by magma. But where does magma come from? And why does it leak out at certain places in the surface of our planet? This question wasn't really figured out by Western scientists until recently. But the Maori have had a story that gives us insights dating back centuries. My good friend Dan will tell you one of these stories from a Maori perspective, a story that links most of New Zealand's active volcanoes.
It starts with a very famous ancestor called Ngāti Roirangi, and he was a navigator on the Arawa Waka, and he made his way down to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and like many of the people on those waka, he was looking for a new place to set up shop. And so he alighted off the canoe at Matata in the Bay of Plenty at a river there, which today we call the Tarawera, but in those days was called Te Awa o Te Atua, the river of the gods. Now, so you can imagine stepping off a canoe, coming across from Hawaii, and then into this place, the river of the gods. And so Ngāti Roirangi made his way inland to try and find a place to live. And he had many adventures on the way there. Those are for another day. But suffice to say, he made his way inland all the way to Lake Taupo, right in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand. And from there he gazed across and he could see this majestic peak on the far side, and he thought, that's where I want to go. So he made his way around, began to walk up the foothills of Mount Tongariro. Now, as he was getting up there, he said to his people, oh, this is a pretty sacred area, this is a pretty tapu area. I've got up there and I've come back down. So he's clambering his way up there. And yeah, it's got a bit of altitude there. Began to get a little bit colder. And then he's thinking, oh, it's cold, but it's beautiful. And then something didn't feel quite right. And he knew that some of his people just couldn't wait. And they'd broken his orders. They'd had some food. And so at once, an immense storm came raging in on him. And it's said to have turned the day into night, or he rangi pō. And such was the ferocity of the storm that Ngāti Roirangi felt that he would surely perish. So he stood up there on the mountain, and he was a man with the power of incantation, that he could call to others in far parts of this world of ours. And so he uttered these words, "Oh, kōrero au I te tonga, I am seized by the cold south wind." And some say that's how we get the name Tongariro for Mount Tongariro today. And he called out to his sisters who were back in Hawaii, Kuiwai and Haungaroa. "O kui e Haungaroa e, tikina mai te ahi. Kuiwai and Haungaroa, send me the warmth, send me the fire." So they heard his brother's plea for warmth, and they gathered together te ahi kāmau, the ancestral fires from the depths. And they wove together 3 kits. The 3 kits they gave to Pupu and to Hoata, 2 fire deities. And they dispatched them. They said, go to our brother. He needs these embers to warm him up. So the fire deities set off, and through subterranean passages made their way down towards Ngāti Roirangi, who stood right in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand on Tongariro. Now, as Te Pupu and Te Hoata made their way underground, they popped their heads up to see if they were going in the right direction. The first place they popped their head up was at Whakaari, White Island. Yes, they could see they were heading in the right direction. They went down again. They popped their heads up again at Motohora, or Whale Island. They popped down again and through up to Putauaki, or Mount Edgecombe. They popped their head down. They jumped across to Rotoiti, and then across to Rotorua, and then across to Tarawera, and then across to Waiotapu, then Orake Korako, to Tauhara, across Lake Taupo to Tokanu, before finally popping their heads up at Tongariro. And along the way, though, they'd been careless. And at every place they'd popped their heads up, they'd spilt one of the embers of the ancestral fires. Thankfully, though, they had 1 ember left in their baskets, and they presented this last ember, or te kete tahi. And so the warmth was brought through the volcano. Ngāti Roirangi was revived and he stood up. Now, one version says at this point that the volcano of Ngaruhoe burst forth at this time as a result of that ancestral fire that Te Pupu and Hoata had brought. Ngāti Roirangi came back down the mountain, he survived, and every place where the deities Te Pupu and Te Hoata popped up along the way, you may find the descendants of Ngāti Roirangi today.
There are several parts of this story that echo with me as a volcanologist. First off, I love a good adventure. As a volcanologist, I can relate to Ngāti Roirangi's journey of exploration. Also, as a scientist, I can see the parallels with science, with the sisters moving along the subterranean passageways, the periodicity of eruptions and geothermal activity as they pop their heads up and leave behind the embers where volcanoes may continue to erupt. The tectonic plate framework that Western scientists have pieced together over the last century tells a similar story from a different perspective of magma moving along pathways in the crust and leaking out periodically. The Earth has a crust that is cracked into different pieces, like a jigsaw wrapped around a sphere. The pieces of this jigsaw can move slowly, sometimes crashing into each other and sometimes drifting apart, but driven by the heat of the planet. At the same time, these puzzle pieces are moving. Melting occurs beneath them and magma rises up and leaks out along the gaps between the pieces. Each piece of the puzzle we call a tectonic plate, and where these puzzle pieces meet is a plate boundary. And this is where volcanoes usually occur, like around the Pacific tectonic plate, producing the awesome Pacific Ring of Fire. Generally, runny, gas-poor magma leaks out where these plates move apart, and sticky, gas-rich magma leaks out where these puzzle pieces crash into each other. Magma can also leak out through pipe-like pathways from deep inside the Earth called mantle plumes, which seem to leak out in a few random places at the surface, not related to the edges of the plates. Two famous examples are the islands of Hawaii and Iceland. These mantle plumes usually erupt runny magma without much gas. New Zealand sits on the edge of the biggest puzzle piece, the Pacific Plate. The Pacific Plate is smashing into and under all the surrounding plates. And around this plate is the plate boundary, the Pacific Ring of Fire, a line of our most epic volcanoes. So the magma that leaks out is generally sticky and with lots of gas, which means big explosive eruptions, my favourite kind. Now, one reason why Iceland is such an exceptional place is that Iceland is a double whammy. It straddles two tectonic plates that are moving apart, which in itself creates a whole bunch of magma, but it also sits on top of a mantle plume. So an enormous amount of runny magma is leaking out without too much gas. At some points in Iceland's history, you would probably literally be drowning in lava, which at first sounds like my dream come true, but thinking about it, it would be less than ideal. As with all fun things in science, the magma does take on a life of its own as it rises through the crust. It can change in character, which means although New Zealand is famous for those spectacular gas-rich eruptions from sticky magmas, sometimes you can get runny magma coming out at the surface. Similarly, although in Iceland you usually have runny magma, you'll visit a location where we find sticky gas-rich magma. This is what keeps us volcanologists on our toes, and why you can get a range of volcano types at both locations.